Okay, everyone, I think we've had about 1 minute, and we're going to reconvene. The title of this afternoon's session is it's a brainstorming session, leveraging university capacity in resilience measurement, research networks, and training the next generation. We'll have with us this afternoon, oh, and by the way, for those who are watching online, don't forget, it's hashtag BIFAD to send your questions or comments in via Twitter. Our session this afternoon will be moderated by Dr. Jennifer Cisse. Again, she is a Senior Risk Advisor at USAID's Bureau for Food Security. Dr. Cisse will moderate a session on leveraging university capacity in resilience measurement, research networks, and training, again, the next generation. Dr. Cisse, please join me.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you all for sticking around. I'm hoping this session will be really productive and exciting, and we're leaving lots of time to engage you all at the end, so please do stay and engage, contribute. So I was going to introduce our speakers, or our panelists, in alphabetical order by their first name, but that's not the order that they're at the table here, so I guess I'll go down the line to be simple. So Josh Ayers is the Senior Risk and Resilience Advisor at Food for the Hungry, where he leads FH's global efforts in disaster risk reduction and resilience. Josh has been involved in the USAID-funded Resilience Evaluation Analysis and Learning, the REAL project. So we're excited to have him here because he can talk kind of about the practitioner world, but he knows USAID really well and the policy world. So next to Josh, we have Tiffany Griffin, who probably needs no introduction at this point, since you've seen her in the last session. Dr. Tiffany Griffin leads resilience measurement, monitoring and evaluation, and strategic analysis for the Center for Resilience at USAID. But she also has experience on the Hill and in academia, so we're going to pull on all those different experiences for this discussion. Next to Tiffany is Dr. Ed Carr, who's a professor and director of international development, community environment at Clark University, where he also directs the Humanitarian Response and Development Lab. Ed is a prolific author, and he works on kind of livelihood dynamics, socio-ecological systems, and climate information systems, among other things. Like Tiffany, Ed also has had positions at USAID in both DACA and E3, so we're able to pull on that experience as well. And last but not least is Dr. Nancy Mock. It is hard to do justice to Nancy's range of experiences in 2 sentences.
She means I'm old.
No. I mean, Nancy founded and co-directed the Disaster Resilience Leadership Academy at Tulane, but she also has deep experience in the humanitarian and emergency space. She was involved in the design of the famine early warning system, FuseNet, and has consulted with WFP, FAO, CDC, USAID, and a variety of practitioner organizations as well. So thank you to all of the panelists. I was hoping so we're going to do this kind of, I think Tiffany described this as game show format.
Talk show.
Talk show format.
No prize.
Wheel of Fortune. So we're going to have one question that I'll pose, and one of the panelists will be the lead kind of respondent for that, and they'll have a few minutes, 4 minutes about to respond, but then we'll open it up for other panelists to respond. So we'll go through a series of questions like that, and then we'll open it up for broader conversation. So just before we get into the questions, I was hoping that I could ask each of you to spend just 1 minute to either critique my introduction or to give more insight in how your work relates to either to resilience measurement specifically or about how we can leverage universities to improve the work that USAID and the practitioner organizations are doing. Thanks. So let's start with Josh and go on down.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. It was a wonderful introduction. I guess I'll talk a little bit about the work that we're doing at Food for the Hungry as part of the REAL consortium funded by USAID, looking into the social cognitive aspects of recipients of early warning information and the decisions that they make or don't make, to heed those warnings and some of the psychosocial sort of factors that go into those decisions, things like self-efficacy and motivation and even risk perception and some of the more subjective aspects of that. So there's been quite a lot of work done out there on how you form early warning messages, how you craft them, how you deliver them, how you disseminate them. We talked a little bit in a meeting yesterday about the difference between dissemination and socialization and activation and those kinds of things. And I think, we're really good at how we disseminate early warning information and messaging, but when it comes to how that's received by different groups of people, and then the decisions that they make internally with that information, we're not quite as good at as we could be. And so that's some of the things that we're looking at on the behavioral change front, trying to understand how people process the information, all the aspects that go into, all the factors that go into that decision to act or not act, or how to act, and then perhaps even getting into how we program around that and how we encourage activities in response to these early warning messages.
So again, my name is Tiffany Griffin. I think my introduction was really great. The only things I'll add, I'm a social psychologist by training, and left academia via a AAAS fellowship, and I think you did too, and then went back. And also held a position in philanthropy for a short amount of time, and so have very different lenses through which I see this work. In the center, we're working quite actively on socializing the resilience measurement principles that we've generated over the past 6 or so years, and then also trying to push forward on various frontier issues. In no way do we think we've arrived at the formula, so quote unquote, for doing this work. We want to continue evolving and tackling challenges as they keep emerging. And then I'm also particularly passionate about using data. I think we could probably not collect data for like 10 years and still not analyze all of the data that we have. And so thinking about creative ways, and as a donor, using resources to provide opportunities to actually really exploit the data that we have through strategic analyses is something that I'm particularly passionate about.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Ed Carr. That was a great introduction. So the only thing I think I'll add is that around the area of resilience, I live a sort of bifurcated life because my academic position is effectively that of a dean. So I spend a lot of time thinking about curriculum and programs and how we train people to work in this particular world. And then when I run my lab, we're actually doing implementation as well as primary research with USAID and other donors around resilience programming. And I try to fit those things together. That doesn't always happen coherently. And I know the first thing I'm going to talk about today is more the lab side, but as we go through conversation, I'll probably get a chance to pull back toward that other role. I've got a couple of university presidents here. They know what I'm talking about.
Well, I would be perhaps a little more frank that bifurcated, I'm more schizophrenic. No, I would consider myself a barefoot academic in the sense that I do quite a bit of field work and quite a bit of applied work on one hand, and also an academic program maker. I love to make academic programs, and one of the reasons, I think, is because early in my career, I started out right after doctoral work as the Feminine Early Warning Systems field director, and I helped co-design the project. And as I tried to staff the project, I couldn't find the people. So I said, well, what do we do about this? Create a program at Tulane. And the Food Security and Nutrition program was born within the framework of the School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. And we produced quite a few graduates who went on to do very important things in the field of development. So it turned me on to this idea that we had a very, very important role to play in higher education. And we'll talk a little bit more about some other insights that I've gotten from working in higher education and development and
developing capacity and partnerships with higher education institutions around the world. And the particular relevance of that for a complex problem, it's really important to have local leadership in low-income and middle-income countries, and we need to support that much more.
Great, thank you, Nancy, and thanks to you all. Sorry, I'm trying to get the mic to work. All right, so as I mentioned, I'm going to start by posing a question to one of our panelists here, and then we're going to open it up for others to join in. So first, to start with Ed, what are examples of success in university USG research and methods for refining those and for creating tools?
Sure, thanks. So I'm going to answer that and hopefully start this conversation by way of an example. So what we've heard a lot today is, resilience. I like the framing I'm hearing of resilience. Resilience is a means to an end, right? This end of durable and increasing well-being. It's not the goal, it's a means to goals. But going along with that is a real risk, if we're thinking about resilience and building resilience, to reinforcing things that are actually the root causes of fragility and other problems that we see in the world. You have to actually understand what you're doing here. Returning to a normative state has a very real risk of reinforcing things that harm or hold people back. And so we have to think about that a lot. And I think about that a lot now from the academic side. I spent the last 15, 20 years thinking about livelihoods and theorizing livelihoods. Someone joked earlier about sort of page-turning reading. I want to read 8,000 words of me picking a fight with an entire discipline over social theory. I can give you that publication. But that work had real relevance to how we think about resilience and how we think about development programming. But the only way that that actually happened was in a partnership with colleagues at USAID, where through my lab, we got engaged with resilience programming projects in Sudanian and Sahelian West Africa. We also got involved with the BRACED program at BIFAD. And what happened is we basically took some of those theories of livelihoods that I've been working on and with our partners built something we called behavioral baselines, which are, in the end, basically taking these theories, applying them to particular places and understanding why people are doing the things that they're doing in the world and doing this at a very granular level, like sub-household kind of level. The reason we were doing this is because the measurement of resilience is really tricky. And one of the things we were trying to do is say, look, you can have changes in what it appears people are doing without any underlying change in the structure of their decision-making or their behavior, which means have you actually done anything at all? Or you could have very little visible change on the surface, have tremendous social changes going on that are actually negatively impacting people. Because it's not a question of do people have resilience or not. As was pointed out at the beginning of the day, everyone has a degree of resilience. If you're shifting things up, you could be removing existing resilience without actually putting anything back in its place. So we've developed these baselines. We've actually had some success in working alongside our partners to build these into programs at the front end so that when these projects end, and most of them will come to an end in the next 2 years, we should be able to actually evaluate whether or not there's any sort of actual behavioral change that is taking place around them. I would point out really quickly, though, there was also a fairly quick win that came along with this. Because we need to understand existing resilience lest we either experiment with or implement something that can do real harm. And I'll give you a very quick example. Because we put these behavioral baselines in place, because we'd actually understood the structure of decision-making in some of the areas we were working, in one of these projects, a year 2 plan for implementation, which was supposed to empower women, and I won't wade into the details of this, not only would it not have worked, it would have spiked the rate of domestic violence in this area. We were almost certain of that. We were able to tell our partners that was coming. They were able to pivot away before it happened. And I thought that if there's an example of like an actual success that happened, because here you have academic research, you have development partners, and enough respect between those two parties to trust one another, both with that information and to trust the information coming from the academic partner to make something work in the world. So for me, there are examples of it. That's just one example of it, but there are ways in which we leverage it. I think the last point there just simply speaks to how important those relationships are. Mm-hmm. We actually need to know each other a lot better, to trust each other, to work together on these things.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. I think it's knowing each other, it's respecting each other, and having ways of communicating that we all understand and are tapped into. Thank you. So I'd like to open it up now. Anybody jump in? Nancy?
Yeah, I think this notion of true partnership and co-creation is really important. And I think that one of the things that perhaps is not as well appreciated about academia and what it can bring to the table is an awful lot of what we would call, I guess, co-funding or sweat equity, however you want to look at it. Most people in academia are really on a mission, and so they will contribute to the furtherance of that mission, whether or not they're paid on a contract. So I think a number of things that we've been involved with, in addition to FUSE, was the SMART initiative, the Standardized Monitoring and Assessment for Relief and Transition, which was a methodologic innovation in its time, the Resilient Africa Network. But a lot of these involved think tank work that was really uncompensated, so I'd throw that in as well.
Mm-hmm.
Tiffany, Josh, any thoughts on that? USG, academia, experience? Okay, great. Well, thank you both. I guess, Josh, I turn to you now. So as we talked about this morning and came up in the first session, resilience is inherently multidisciplinary. However, many in academia and government are aware of the barriers to interdisciplinary collaboration, including academic incentives, structural silos, et cetera. Have you encountered such challenges kind of in your work, coming from a slightly different background? And what suggestions do you have, perhaps to us in government and academia, to overcome these?
Yeah, if you don't mind, just humor my metaphor for a second. But I have 2 young kids at home, and so I like to tell stories a lot. And we're all familiar with the story of the men who touch parts of the elephant, right? One man touches the leg of the elephant and says, "Oh, an elephant's like a tree," and another one touches the side of the elephant's like a wall. And I think in some ways that's what's happening with resilience. I mean, I think as long as resilience is conceptualized as a set of capacities, then it invites it invites us to study it as just that, as a box of capacities, right? And we can understand that yes, resilience is physical assets. It's access to physical assets. It's social capital. How much social capital do you have? What sort of quality of social capital that you have? Do you have access to all these capitals or capacities? And I think I was excited to hear that Ed was on the panel, because I think the work that they're doing in understanding how all of these capacities are actually used by people. I mean, if you think about all the capacities that all of us have at our disposal to be resilient or to act resiliently, the combination of all of those things is sort of exponential, right? I mean, how I employ my physical assets or even my political capital in a country like the United States. I mean, there's options at my fingertips, and I think what we need to get better at is sort of studying how people make decisions on how to employ those capitals, right? I mean, that's to me a fundamentally different question than do they have that capacity on hand. And so, yeah, I guess in terms of suggestions, when it comes to how you sort of craft even research topics or research questions, I think sometimes it can be a tendency to want to sort of narrow it down to the sort of least common denominator, something that's easiest to study and easiest to get funded, I mean, to be honest. But I think if we can potentially fund research in a way that allows for us to come to know what our unknown unknowns are, if that makes sense. I mean, I think a lot of times when we set out to study the resilience of a particular people group in a particular context in the face of a particular hazard, we don't always know what we don't know. And I think so, at the front end when you're designing your research, it's not always easy to know who needs to be on that team because you don't know what you don't know. And so I'm thinking about, at Food for the Hungry, we're implementing some Food for Peace funding in DRC and Ethiopia, and they use a refine and implement approach where you're allowed sort of leeway as you get into the study or as you get into the implementation to change course. And I think it would be really helpful as you get into these research projects when you start to realize, oh, you know what, actually we need an ethnographer on this project, or we need an engineer on this project. I mean, I have an engineering background, so are you given the leeway, are you given the rope to really do that, to make that decision, to bring that person on board and to get it funded? Those kinds of ideas of more flexible funding to incorporate more transdisciplinary research, I think would be helpful.
Great, thank you. Ed, do you want to
Sure.
jump in?
Just a thought along this also is when we think about research and research funding, which of course preoccupies a lot of academics, I think we make a mistake sometimes of assuming that there's a hard bifurcation between primary research and applied research. I would argue that the work, so my lab over the last 5 years, about $2 million of funding, every single bit of it is contract work with a development donor. I just haven't bothered with NSF at this point. An 8% acceptance rate isn't worth my time. So, sooner or later I'll apply to them again, but not right now. That said, yeah, I'm writing reports and deliverables for development donors, but we're also allowed to use the data to answer other kinds of questions, theoretical questions, things like that. There's a feedback loop from the work that I've been doing in my lab for the last 5 years that's coming back to a theory article about how we even understand resilience. And the semester's almost over, so I'll actually have time to write it. But I think that being creative about where you get your funding, what you think about doing with funding, and the kinds of different things you can do in partnership with, but not just in partnership with, also on the side of your own work is really important here.
Tiffany?
Yeah, I wanted to. So what I heard in the question was kind of this notion of how do you make interdisciplinarity work, right? Mm-hmm. And so I will say a couple things around that. One, the resilience measurement work that USAID has been working in partnership with others on is inherently interdisciplinary. And it has been extremely challenging at times, I mean, to be very frank about it. But I also, in the same breath, would say that I think that's what lends to the richness, right? So these problems that communities are facing are extremely complex. They cannot be addressed through a single sector, and many of the factors that keep emerging are actually kind of trans-sectoral or pan-sectoral or whatever. So things like social capital or aspirations. When you bring together a social psychologist, an anthropologist, a number of development economists, you get some screaming matches, and then after 5 years, you have a robust framework that everyone buys into. You also, I think, understand the challenges in a different way and understand the solutions in a different way. I will say that some of the challenges that emerge, though, are kind of value judgments attached to certain disciplines. I think the interdisciplinary approach breaks down when disciplines aren't able to bring the learnings from their disciplines to bear. I think it's particularly challenging with social sciences, specifically psychology, where there's this vocabulary that laypersons and researchers share, right? Like, Nana talks about self-esteem, right? I mean, like, everyone kind of uses the vocabulary of psychologists, and yet psychologists mean something very specific when they distinguish self-efficacy from self-esteem or self-perception, or something very specific when they're talking about identity. And we're talking like 100 years of research worth of specificity, that if that's not valued in the same way as, an econometric model or something like that, you can see interdisciplinarity break down. And so I would encourage it, and then encourage it in the sense that operationally you have to really respect all of the disciplines equally coming together to address problems. When you have that, both in an academic setting and in the development setting, I think you get a really holistic approach that's actually actionable. And hopefully we've demonstrated that today.
Thanks, Tiffany. Nancy, yeah? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the age-old problems of academia, the stovepiping and the disciplinary blinders that, especially the more education you get, the worse it gets. But But I think in terms of the balance, and Tiffany, I really build on what you said, that the real way to success is transdisciplinary leadership with a multidisciplinary team, so that you have both the breadth and the depth. And you know, that's actually how, when we redesigned Fuse, that's exactly what we put into place. And it worked. And so I think that the leadership issue is really important, because leaders can make some of that happen, especially if they're respected leaders. And so I think that's an important point. Now, the other is sort of institutional, structural. You know, oftentimes, you know, the degree programs are in disciplines. There are centers that are non-degree programs that actually do research. That's a bad model. The centers should be giving degrees as well. So we really need to look at different kinds of models for the organization of academia. And I can tell you, I've had experience with both kinds of centers. A center that has a three-legged stool survives and thrives. A center that's, you know, hamstrung by not being able to offer degrees, or who has to farm out their teaching to schools, it's not a very viable model.
Great, thank you. I had something I wanted to mention on qual-quant too, but we can come back to that if we have. Well, I was going to say, it was interesting. So Ed and I were talking over lunch with some others, and we were talking about the fact that, so we've had a lot of great conversations today about the need to improve our focus on qualitative data collection and make sure that those are, those types of techniques are given the respect maybe and focus that they deserve. But one thing that we were talking about is how often, you know, we might do a quantitative survey design and then add focus groups on top of it, as opposed to maybe doing some qualitative work up front to help us really focus in on what that quantitative data collection should focus on. So that was, I thought it was worth mentioning that discussion we'd had previously. Great, so Tiffany, if I could turn to you now. Working with government on tools and evaluations is sometimes seen as incompatible with academic achievement, particularly tenure and academic promotion, which are largely decided on publication records. Given your experience in both academia and government, have you found this incompatibility to really be the case? And what suggestions do you have for academics and USAID staff who are interested in working together?
Yes, I think there's the potential misconception that the incentives of development and the incentives of academia are incompatible. They can be, but they need not be. So I think we have examples right in the room of folks who work in both spaces, who publish, and then who also push forward the development endeavor. The other thing is that, you know, in publishing, you're always looking for really robust, strong data. And I think we, you know, have demonstrated that there's no dearth of that in the resilience measurement space, for instance. And so providing opportunities for graduate students and training opportunities, but then also faculty, both, you know, with soft and hard appointments, you know, data and resources, you know, particularly certain disciplines like public health. Academics work with one data set their entire career, right? So, yes, so that's the first thing, that you can publish and also push forward the development endeavor. But let's, you know, be clear, like the only incentive of academics is not publishing, right? There are other incentives. One is money, right? Securing funding. And I think, Ed, you gave a really great example of, at least in development, there being resources that are quite untapped, where there are other resources, NIH and NSF in particular, that are quite overtapped and shrinking in some cases. So that's another incentive alignment that I think is often a missed opportunity. Universities are also driven by position, comparative advantage. So if I think about the university as a business, you know, there are different ways to distinguish, right? Every university wants the best and the brightest students. There are rankings, there are all, you know, all sorts of downstream effects of being like the great university. And so I would encourage academics to think about position with respect to having a really robust development endeavor, really strong relationships with development actors as one comparative advantage that may be underutilized or under-tapped. And then lastly, or penultimately, the motivations of students. So, I was an academic, PhD student who was never quite satisfied with my training, right? I knew that I wanted to do something with my research that I wasn't being trained to do. And typically what happens is you have a pipeline issue, right? Like many of those students fall out, at least in my discipline. I'll say maybe in other disciplines there are other avenues. But in psychology, if you want to, and you're not a clinical psychologist, if you want to work in an applied setting, you usually fall out of the discipline at some point. So for those students, thinking about ways to cultivate the really robust research training and then offer opportunities that aren't traditional academic positions or appointments, that's another opportunity for partnership between the two. I think I was really lucky. I worked with an advisor who 50% of his students went into academia and 50% of his students took non-academic careers, and he was very clear about the fact that he assigned no value of either option from like day one of our training. He's like, some of you guys will go this path, some of you guys will go, I will not, pass you over for grants. I will not pass you over for publishing opportunities. These are all real constraints that graduate students are constantly calculating the degree to which they should make certain decisions based upon oftentimes like resources. So he was very clear with his own socialization of us, and he was also very clear about his applied work. So he sat on boards for the American Psychological Association. He talked about his motivation for entering academia, which was applied. He was motivated by the research of Kenneth Clark, and if you don't know who that is, you should Google it. And so he led by example, and then also, the last thing I'll say is at the University of Michigan, there was an institutional structure to help students who did not want to enter academia. So it's not enough to have an advisor who's just like, yeah, that's okay, I won't judge you, go forth, right? You have to have a structure, and that's grants, that's training opportunities. Like they bring me back every year to talk about my experience to students through a summer program that they have. And they reinforce the notion, you have to have strong research training. You will not get a PhD from Michigan and not know how to do research. And there are other things you can do. We don't really know what they are. So we're going to bring the resources to bear from other folks who have made that decision. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany. That's excellent. Anybody else want to chime in on that question?
So I'll first of all, I agree with absolutely everything I just heard there. I'll do a brief plug. So the unit I run, in fact, I left the University of South Carolina. I had a good job, and I only took the job I took because International Development, Community, and Environment, or the Department of Everything, as it sometimes is known, I took this job because it was this unique entity that didn't have a discipline. On my faculty, I have environmental scientists, GI scientists, anthropologists. I've got at least an economist. I've got just a whole range of different people. It's this place that is centered on thinking about how we deal with major challenges in the world. That's what we frame the entire educational process around. And so thinking about how to then align incentives, one of the things I have to do, I just finished doing it, is I have to evaluate my faculty every year. I have to evaluate their performance. One of the things I get to do in IDCE that a lot of other departments can't do, especially if they're worried about ranking, I get to count everything people produce. So did you write reports for someone that you're in a partnership with? I can count that as a publication, and I do. I also will count your refereed publications. Did you get a grant? That's great. Did you get a contract? That's also great. And I'm able to do that in part because Clark carved, don't take credit for this, I showed up after they'd already done it, but they carved an institutional space for this thing to exist. And then we, myself and my faculty colleagues, have done a lot then to kind of protect that space and to make it more robust over time. And what we've seen is that the institution's actually seen the value of it and has actually over time started to trust what we're doing, and now they kind of mostly leave us alone to do what we're doing. And I think that that's also done a lot reputationally for the institution. Our international development students are actually pretty well known in this field now. So anyway, a plug for that kind of open space. Again, I've got university presidents lurking, so carve some space, guys.
Yeah, Jen, I would add, because it builds very nicely on what Ed said, I actually did create the International Health and Development Program at Tulane in International Health. And what happened was we were called the mini school, and nobody could figure out how we fit into the structure of the School of Public Health. And finally, various deans like draw and quartered it and so forth, and it's an ongoing issue. We have a new dean, so hopefully it'll come back together. But it's always, a little bit at risk. But I think it's this issue of leadership to keep those kinds of programs going. And to integrate within the incentives, which are promotion and tenure standards, to make sure those things are actually valued. And that's I think, a really big issue.
Great, thank you guys for that. Okay, so we have one last question, which we're going to give to Nancy before we do a last round the table. So Nancy, a pipeline of talented researchers and leaders in policy and management is critical for our success in mainstreaming resilience work. How should we go about training the next generation, both domestically, so in your different programs, and in the other countries where we work, to meet the challenges raised during this session?
Well, let's start with thinking about the problem that we're dealing with and what universities really do bring to the table. And there are two things that they bring to the table. One is that they're leadership machines. They are the apex of the workforce, whether it's analytics research or policy and professional development. They're the apex. So they're leadership machines. And two, they're reservoirs of excess cognitive capital. There are a lot of people sitting around universities, particularly students looking for projects, theses, et cetera. There are faculty members, and this is, I think, a tremendous opportunity for resilience work. There are faculty members who have done a lot of work that is related to resilience, but they haven't actually yet embarked in this resilience, interesting problem area. They can easily be brought on board. An example, we had a math stats person in the math department who had been doing genetics research. She had a sabbatic point in time. We connected her up with World Food Program, and she analyzed their data for a summer, and all of a sudden she now understands resilience, and she's involved in this work, but there are many more of those. And because resilience is so broad in terms of the methodologic scope of skill sets you need and so forth, it's really important to draw on this cognitive capital that rests in universities that is yet untapped. So it's in a sense, excess cognitive capital. So for the leadership machine, first, again, it's this pipeline approach. From the undergraduate up through the postgraduate level, we need a strategy for building these future leaders. And I think we need to think about it both in terms of broad and very specific programming. And broad in the sense that we want to both influence the supply and demand for risk resilience analytical information. And the demand is generated by mainstreaming resilience thinking into undergraduate curriculum, to core courses, and to graduate core courses, and so forth, in a variety of our schools. The specific can really be developed through specific degree and certificate-bearing programs, and I think that's very important. We want to create a credentialed workforce in this area. And so the specific programs, they could actually be, coordinate type programs. They can be, separate degree-bearing programs in something like risk and resilience analytics. I see that as very viable right now. In fact, I'm probably going to do one of those. That's probably my next project. And we need to focus very strongly on building the capacity of institutions in low and middle income, higher education institutions in low and middle income countries. That's very critical. I think the Resilient Africa Network was one attempt to do that, but it needs to go farther and deeper. I think that the potential to be putting out resilience analysts and resilience thinking leaders who demand resilience analytics is really very great, and it's probably where we're gonna have the most impact on building resilience in low-income environments. And so leveraging the cognitive capital of faculty, let's make more space to bring new faculty in to look at resilience problems and to build these multidisciplinary teams. Let's also, I mean, we have several examples here of doctoral students who have studied with various of us professors who are interested in resilience and have done their doctoral work in resilience analytics. Let's build networks of those people so that they can start to learn from each other. And then again, this network notion for these institutions of higher learning, I do think that there are some core institutions, both here and abroad, that have focused on this problem. Let's get those guys together. Let's look at curriculum. Let's try to see what we believe are sort of fundamental competencies that we believe all of us should have to start. And then let's look at differentiation to meet the needs of these various skill set needs that we have. So I guess that would be where I would start off.
Great, thank you, Nancy. And before I open it up, I just wanted to add one thought that I had when you were talking about these numbers of students looking for projects. When I was at Cornell, Cornell manages, I guess they chair something called CompSustNet, which is Computational Sustainability Network. And they convene brilliant computer science students and faculty working on machine learning and artificial intelligence. And what they're looking for are interesting problems to which they can apply their skills. And so I think we need to do a better job of finding those networks and shouting and saying, look, we've got a lot of problems and questions and data sets, but we need your expertise and we want to partner with you. Others who want to chime in on this question? Ed? Please.
No, go ahead.
So the question of sort of how to train, or what would be useful ways to train people, and also I think the question, the way Nancy was framing around sort of building leadership. I'll go back, actually I'm pretty proud of this actually. IDCE, we don't have a discipline. So one of the things when I came in we did a teardown of our curriculum. We're home to 7 different degree programs, and they had started to all behave like little departments within one school, and that wasn't going to work out for us. Here we have a place that houses domestic and international research and everything crossing nature and society. It's a very unique entity. And so one of the things that we did is we took all of our degree programs and cut down the core courses in them rather dramatically. And every student in IDCE now will spend half of their class time in cross-cutting concentrations. And they're framed around major problems, climate change impacts and adaptation, refugees and forced migration, that kind of stuff. But we have unusual strength in my faculty. And these students, any degree program, a student can come from any degree program and go into any concentration. That's by design. The idea is to have environmental scientists, development studies students, GI scientists, all those kind of folks in one room, talking about something like climate change adaptation, learning to wrestle with these problems across disciplinary and sectoral lines, because, and anybody here who works in any of these organizations, donor or implementer, you know already, right? You don't get to go into one of these organizations, sit down and go, I'm an environmental scientist, and like hang out in your box. That is not how it works. You end up in a room with 7 different people with 7 different backgrounds. None of you speak the same disciplinary language. Anyone who knows how to translate in that setting can become a leader, because they're the person who can pull this all together. So we've actually redesigned a curriculum around that premise. And we're going to see if it works. We'll find out in the next couple of years. It'll make my faculty insane as we attempt to teach, I mean myself personally insane as we attempt to teach this diversity of students in our classes. But honestly, we felt like it was the only way forward if we're serious about attacking major challenges in things like resilience.
Tiffany?
I just had 2 quick things. So one thing you mentioned the word, Ed mentioned the word translation. So I would encourage translation courses within the context of research programs. So whenever I was writing something up for publication, I was always given the same feedback, and that's switch your intro and your conclusion. And I'm like, why? Like, this is why I'm doing it, and then I'll background like all the theory and all that. And they were like, I was always told, no, start with the theory, and then add this like little really short paragraph at the end on implications, because it's your job to do the research and know the process and know the theory, and it's someone else's job to figure out why it matters. Literally direct quote from someone in my program. So, for people who are interested in these applied contexts and real world problems, that doesn't feel right? It doesn't feel like the purpose of research. At least it didn't feel right for me. And how great would it have been to not have to learn how to do this on the job? So I think some sort of translation course or implications training program or something like that would be really great. The other thing is, I'm often asked by graduate students, like, how do I become more practical, or what can I do now as a graduate student to kind of position myself really well for leaving academia in 5 years? One thing, I tell them lots of things, but one thing that I think has been really successful is that I suggest that they do a blog post for every journal article that they write. Mm-hmm. So it trains you to, talk more succinctly, to talk to real people. Maybe it's a video, or I don't know what, Snapchat or something like that, whatever these people the new generation is doing, but some sort of kind of very practical application of your work that still allows you to maintain the integrity of your work, but communicate to other audiences. And so encouraging activities like that in the context of graduate training, I think, is another really great way to train students.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask Josh also to share some maybe non-academic thoughts on this.
Non-academic thoughts. I'd second and third, if I can, what Ed said earlier. I think it does work, actually. I think coming out of the engineering field and construction management and architecture and sort of landing in the NGO world, I think I was sort of forced to become a generalist. In those rooms, I would sit there and think like an engineer. I would speak like an engineer, and it just wouldn't quite translate. So I had to learn those skills of generalization and kind of learning some of the social pieces and all of that. And I think, I've had the blessing of benefiting from a center at Oxford where I studied that brought together those multiple disciplines. It sat in the School of Architecture, for crying out loud, which most folks would look at you kind of cross-eyed, like, why is it in the School of Architecture? But it was a beautiful thing, because it meant that there was space there for technically sort of built environment people to be there, along with some of the social scientists and some of those other people. So I do think it works, and I do think there is a place for practitioners to be in the academic field, sort of. I think, was it Mark earlier? I wrote this down. Mark Constas said earlier that practitioners should be driving our applied research, and of course they should be. And I think, and Tiffany mentioned earlier the need for actors to serve as mediators between the academic rigor and the practical application and the policy. And I think there are a lot of generalists who are practitioners and implementers with NGOs like Food for the Hungry, that could be encouraged to enter more heavily into the academic field to be that mediator. My previous career was as a construction manager, and I sort of sat between engineers and architects and owners, builders, and had to speak that language. And I think there is a place for those mediators to be able to bring these multiple facets of resilience together and translate almost languages and to be able to get people moving in the same direction. So it's great.
Thanks, Josh. So before we move to questions, I wanted to ask each of you, please, to share one kind of out-of-the-box idea that could have large impacts on how U.S. academia and USAID work together to further resilience measurement and practice. Let's start with Josh.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I kind of talked a little bit earlier about this, the possibility maybe of of funding mechanisms that allow research teams to evolve over time. I think if we can somehow crack that nut, I think that will unleash some of this transdisciplinary study in a more effective way. I also wonder if, and I don't think this necessarily sits with universities or even with practitioners, but somewhere there might be, I wonder if there might be the possibility of broadening the expertise of peer review panels to allow space for transdisciplinary academic journal articles to be published or to even be considered by researchers to be pursued. You know, I think sometimes there's some reluctance there to go transdisciplinary because, well, what's the peer review panel going to say about it? Are they going to understand it? Will it translate? And I think that's a limiting factor to getting some of this rigorous academic stuff out there in a transdisciplinary way. I don't know whose responsibility that is to make that change. I don't even know if it's possible, but we're brainstorming. So
Great, thank you. Tiffany?
So initially, I was going to suggest creating an inter-university consortium, and then I realized that there is an inter-university consortium. It's called ICPSR. It's housed in the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. The Institute for Social Research is actually an independent research entity, so it's just housed at Michigan, but it's not kind of, it's not a part of the university per se. And it's this international consortium of 750 academic institutions that provides leadership and training and data access, curation, methods of analysis. They have a summer program. Folks from all over the world come to take various training courses. And so one out-of-the-box idea that I had is maybe creating a working group within ICPSR focused on resilience measurement. USAID could perhaps provide some strategic guidance, kind of capacity building in and around what our resilience measurement principles are, and perhaps even some funding. And institutionalizing this training of graduate students and faculty, like faculty often come and take courses through ICPSR as well. And then also there's a data warehousing capacity as well. So it's this one central location for the loads and loads and loads of data that we're creating over time. So linking up with ICPSR is my out-of-the-box idea.
Great, I love it, thank you. Ed?
I'm a contrarian, so I'm actually going to, it's not out of the box. I'm going to ask for something that's in the box, but I wish you'd bring it back, which is, can we go back to funding international students, please, who come over here for graduate study? It was one of the most successful things this government ever did in any number of development arenas. But if you're worried about resilience, think about what you saw earlier today. We need a lot more capacity on the ground in the countries where we're working. It's fine if we're building it here. We should be building it here. I'm in favor of that. But please, can someone bring that? It was there. Just find the old paperwork and bring it back, please. That's all I want.
I want to build on what Ed said and then add my own, thought. But I think that's important, but I think it needs to be done in a much more structured way than it was in the past. It needs to be done with the notion of institutional capacity building in resilience in those countries. And so that's really important, and that capacity, the administrative capacity has to be there. And I would say USAID should, through its higher education and development initiatives, not forget that institutional capacity as well as technical capacity is absolutely critical. Now, let me add my other little thing. So I thought, cognitive capital campaign for rapid scale up and professionalization of risk and resilience analytics. Now, I think this is a vision. And so...
Wait, could you say that again?
We need an acronym.
I'm thinking I'm like CCB.
Cognitive capital campaign to rapidly scale up and professionalize risk and resilience analytics through university partnerships. And there are a lot of things that could be done there, but there are some there's something that I felt for a long time is a natural thing for USAID to ask on cost share, and that would be that the academic entity actually creates educational products and programs as part of their cost share. So then in that way we continue to build the programs and strengthen the resilience risk and resilience analytics piece. I also think competitive small grants for doctoral research would be a good thing. Academic student labs for crowdsourcing some solutions to the problems we've been looking at. And then I believe that it would be important that we all support the evolution of a professional society for this field. I think that is important. You know, you can argue that it's stovepipes, not really, not if it's sufficiently interdisciplinary in its conception.
Great, thank you. All right, well, with that, I'd like to thank you all. If we could have a round of applause, and then we'll open it up. So I'd like to first ask if any of the BIFAD members who are here have any questions or comments that they'd like to share.
Well, let me first commend you all. This is an extremely exciting session, and needless to say, I would endorse many of the recommendations that you've made. I just want to really add one real emphasis because of work I've recently gotten engaged in at the University of Missouri, and that is the power of interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinary kind of thinking at the undergraduate level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We've created a peer mentoring program that truthfully has caught me quite by surprise in its power. And it came about by students themselves. We were working with a great cadre of students on a lot of food security issues. And we sat down with them and said, what's missing? If you looked at your entire educational spectrum here at Missouri, which has always prided itself on being interdisciplinary to a great extent, they said what we really lack is the ability to work with each other on interdisciplinary issues. So we created a peer mentoring program. I'll make this real snappy, but where they work with each other and come up with a project that we try to fund, you know, some of the best examples of it to deal with problems of global food security and extreme poverty. It can be domestic, international, or a combination of the two. Predominantly undergraduate, with about a fourth of the students being graduate and professional students. And it's just so incredibly exciting that I come away every semester with a high, just you know, having experienced it. But I just want to thank you. Some of you alluded to that, and I would just stop with one final statement that Tiffany made so strongly, I think, and that is that the power of the discipline that is brought to bear in this breaks down unless the attention is given to the virtue, so to speak, of the discipline itself. And I don't think anyone would disagree with that, but I was very interested in how you related that to the work that Ed is doing also. And that sounds, I think, to many people a bit contradictory, but I mean, I captured it as being totally on the same wavelength, but just will offer that in case I'm wrong there.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And I loved the last set of out-of-the-box ideas. We need to figure out what to do with that so it just doesn't stay a conversation. I'd love to add one more, listening to today's conversations, and that would be a mechanism to take the need and demand that comes from the field and link that into this hub you want to create. It could be ISPCR or something else, and then a group that takes those needs and demands and figures out how to move them. Is there an institution already working on this? Do we have funding for it? Do we need a crowdsourcing weekend to brainstorm this? But linking that field-based demand back to this cognitive capital that we need to work harder.
Thank you. Any other BIFAD comments, thoughts? Great. Well, I'd love to open it up if there are other people who have questions or thoughts, ideas.
The one in back.
Hi, my name's Emily Gallagher. I work at New America. I think since I work at a think tank, my mind naturally goes to who else can be in this equation. Especially, I mean, DC has many think tanks, but I think it's a trend growing around the world where there's quasi-research organizations that are that could be an easy partner with both universities and development with an eye to policy and government as well. So I wonder what role you think that these quasi-research organizations can play with both.
No, that's great. Thank you for reminding us that there's a broader world outside of our little collaboration here. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. My name is Abdullah Mbeng, again from the diaspora. My question, I was just curious, because I haven't heard it during the 2 days, that this approach of positive deviance, which hopefully you'll excuse, I'm not a scholar nor a practitioner of resilience, but I think positive deviance is the fact that in any community, there's always few people that find a way by uncommon and successful behavior to resist better than the rest of the group. And it started with the nutrition work where they find out some family were able to nourish their children. And in Africa, I believe that that's the low-hanging fruit that's out there. One example, during the Ebola, of course, it took leadership. President Johnson said that I'm not going to let it happen. But if you look at it, was only when the local folks start using local solution that they stop Ebola. And I'm just asking why, or are you currently using positive deviance to identify those outliers that can be replicated on a larger scale?
Tim's shaking his head. I don't know if he wants to say anything. Go ahead.
He has the microphone.
Oh, well, he has the mic already, so.
I'm glad you brought that up. We actually do use positive deviance as part of our analytical approach in looking at it. I couldn't talk about it today, but we'll share the documents with you. You can see the analysis coming out on positive deviance. The other 2 points I wanted to make was that there's this Master in Development Practice program that is in multiple universities around the country that would be easy to tap into the curriculum that's going on with those trainings and try to have a module built into those for resilience measurement. We already do it at the University of Arizona through the Master's Development Practice there. And so I think that you could do that easily with other programs. The second thing, and I don't know if it still exists, but OFDA was actually funding a lot of universities for disaster. I think they might even called it disaster resilience. And they had a master's program in that. For example, we were helping to teach those courses at Bari Adar University in Ethiopia. I knew that there were other universities that they were supporting in South Africa and several other countries. So I don't know if those programs are still going, but this kind of builds on what Nancy was talking about, that we can tap into stuff that USAID is already funding and maybe help change the curriculum going on there.
Do you want to say something?
Do you want to answer those or take one or two more?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Yes, to both your points, Tiffany and Nancy, about the centers being able to...
What's your name and affiliation?
Yang Bodu, independent advisor on the Sustainable Development Goals. So to your mention of having all these centers being able to grant degrees and whatnot, right now what I've been finding is that depending on the state, but quite many are rather tightly bound by various mandates and bylaws. I know that with the New York State, there are certain centers, if you say centers for advanced technology and such, where you're technically not allowed to offer any degree programs. So do you see any scope for enabling more freedom to maneuver amongst these centers?
I just wanted to add on to Tim's ideas.
Your name
Oh, sorry.
and affiliation,
Yep.
please.
Heather Danton. I work with John Snow, Inc. on the Spring Project. We're a global USAID nutrition project, ending in a month. But I don't know if you're familiar with the Agriculture, Nutrition, Health Academy. So we've been doing a lot of work. I do a lot of multi-sectoral nutrition and agriculture work, linking them, multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral, very challenging, very complex. Resilience is a large part of what we think about and try to incorporate, but the ANH Academy is a group. It's housed in the Leverhulme Institute within the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. They are funded with various sources, small amounts, but their partners are comprised of universities here in the United States as well as in developing countries. And they sponsor graduate students in particular, not only with good research practices, but give them an opportunity to learn how to present and how to write. And once a year, they have a very large conference. It's very well attended, usually someplace in the developing world. This year, it's next month in Ghana. And so it's a great opportunity for these students to present their work, and they are provided small stipends as well for additional work. Right now, they have an additional program to fund indicator development around multi-sectoral nutrition-sensitive ag indicators, national down to local level. So they're doing some really interesting things, and they have a very strong community of practice. And these are all things that I think that the resilience community could benefit from. So if people want names, I can give them to you.
Thank you, and I just want to take the opportunity to add on to that. I think that not only do those types of programs, Cornell had a similar program that brought in students to work with mentors at Cornell, faculty mentors, but there's the hard skill benefit of coming to an institution like that. There's the work on the soft skills that I think a lot of those students benefit from, but something that my advisor, Chris Barrett, would say is it's also the research networks. A lot of these students may be the most talented researchers, but if they don't have collaborators, co-authors, and can't tap into those networks, it can be really hard for them to publish. So I'd add that to your list of great things that those types of programs can do. Joe?
Okay, just one kind of umbrella question that's maybe potentially a little too big for the conversation, but also does potentially tie into a lot of these other questions around mechanisms for these ties. So going back to both the issues of incentive disalignment between academia and policy and the translation rift, I feel like we can overcome a lot of those here together, but then there's another tier of policy to politics and about seeing these things through to their end in actual policy adjustment and change. And I've been party to many situations where we really did get a great deal of alignment on the policy side, and then when push came to shove and decisions were actually happening, the lobbyists win because the academics are then out of their field, and by then also there's the time scale issue. Some of the good people like you who are in government, that's not your job, you've moved on to something else, and that kind of, there's not, an issue in continuity there. And I'm wondering, with any of these mechanisms in mind, including the idea of the think tanks, have you guys seen roles where there was a mechanism that helped with that last step of actually getting things through to the end, or have ideas for how these various mechanisms could be used kind of in that direction?
Great, so I think we only have a few more minutes, so if we want to, unless there's pressing comments, turn back. I don't know if any of the panelists have any thoughts or responses. Tiffany?
I'll speak to two things from the multiple reflections that just came up. One, just wanted to echo our colleagues' comment around positive deviance and learning from the community itself. So resilience is a lot of things to a lot of people, but over and above kind of how it's operationalized in development, it has an inherent meaning. And part of that inherent meaning is learning from communities themselves around what they're doing to subsist and survive and thrive in many cases. And so applying a positive deviance lens to look at the variation in a community, so kind of pulling from some of the tenets of Jen's work, looking at the variation, and then pulling from some of the tenets of Tim's work and explaining why and how from the voices of the communities themselves is an extremely robust application of resilience measurement and very important to maintaining the integrity of the concept as we apply these principles. Second point, I wanted to speak to Joanna's question. Super important. I'm going to answer a slightly different question, but I think it speaks to the issue. And that's driving, like kind of the last mile. And one example where we've seen our work, I'll frame it, where we've seen the evidence drive uptake at a policy level comes from Ethiopia. A program called GRAD had really great graduation impacts, but the impacts were relatively small if you think about the fact we're talking about a country of 57 million people, right? But where we've seen it have a transformative effect is the government itself adopting principles generated from evidence and applying it to their government-run safety net program, right? So that's a catalytic transformative effect. Would that transformative effect have occurred without evidence? I don't think so. I often, as kind of an evidence person or a measurement person, pretty disconnected from communities, wonder if I'm actually helping people, like real people. But examples like that give me confidence that measurement work is really important, because without being able to strategically tell a story around the work that you're doing, you kind of stay like small and projectized, right? You don't have that transformative, scaled up approach. So that's not exactly addressing your question, but I think it is an example of evidence catalyzing decision-making at a policy level of a host government itself to make pretty substantial changes to its programming that impacts millions of people's lives.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think that, we've had some other examples of successful research projects that has been convincing evidence that has been scaled by a host government such as the Kenya Livestock Insurance Program. And I'm wondering if we can bring it back to the diaspora conversation about thinking how we can share the evidence, not just with our government partners. I think we should be doing that and improving our ability to do that, but also possibly with other stakeholders that may be domestic as well as international stakeholders who can help resonate and push on some of that messaging.
Can I just shout out a comment? Yeah, you need to speak in the microphone.
So just a common thread here. So this is Greg Collins. I'm the director of the Center for Resilience at USAID. There's a common thread here that pulls us all together. The reason that evidence is resonating with partner governments and leading to policy change is the technical capacity of a technocratic group of people within government who were supported through investment in their education. So we're dealing with people who can consume evidence and make their own policy argument. So I think it kind of brings together a lot of what we're talking about here, but we're at a very different moment now. And what Ed said and people clap to, when we go to the Sahel and we're in a place like Niger or we're in Burkina Faso working with SILS, and you're just amazed at the technical capacity, and what is your background? Many of those people's background tie back in some way, if not having been supported with education here, received a prize or come back for some training and support. So those investments 20, 30 years on are the reason evidence is changing policy.
Nancy.
Yeah, I guess I would, I think we've taken care of positive deviance. We all believe in it. The quasi-academic institutions, certainly on the think tank side, definitely. The limitation is the lack of credentialing, and that is the big limitation. But that doesn't preclude other participation. There are clearly a lot of related educational and training programs, and I think one of the things we probably need to do sooner rather than later is to map out some of these, do an asset mapping of where things are happening. And then the OFDA program, I don't know, but here is another issue where there was I think a bankrupt way we did work in the past, which was to say we would go and help people develop curriculum and go away, right? And the truth is, it's a different investment. If you really want to, create programs or strengthen programs in the field in low-income countries, you've got to realize that it takes more than that. Then the SDG, the scope to maneuver, it depends on the university. Some universities have much more flexibility. Typically, private universities have more flexibility in that respect than public. In my experience, though, if you're determined and you really fight the fights, you can make it happen.
Ed?
Just two quick answers. The first, it's about think tanks or quasi-research organizations. It's nothing new to say that one thing academia definitely could take from greater engagement with those is that just think tanks are so much better at messaging and so much better at communicating than academics. We can talk to each other, but we're not great outside of that, whereas that's what think tanks spend their time doing. So greater partnerships there would be enormously useful for getting findings into the world, but also opportunities to train students differently. This gets to some of the things Tiffany was asking for in terms of translational thinking. I mean, I'm not sure necessarily you want academics teaching other academics how to translate research. That doesn't always play out so well. But constructive partnerships with organizations that are willing to do that would be pretty fantastic. And the only thing I was actually going to say, almost exactly what Nancy said, there is freedom to maneuver in different institutions. One of the nice things about my unit, again, this is not I don't get credit for this. Clark set up my unit as what's called an enterprise. We're semi-budget autonomous. So I basically have to raise my budget every year. So I worry about everything from like marketing and recruitment all the way out to curriculum all the time. But at the same time, if we're bringing in the money, they let us do stuff. And so if we can pay for it, so we can stand up a new concentration. We stood up a degree in global health, community and global health, because we saw a huge need there. We saw we had expertise in it, and really the institution went, okay, go ahead. It also we can rapidly close things down, too, if they're not working. We're used sort of as an incubator in a lot of ways for new programs. So, I mean, I live in this very unique institutional space, but when you're in it, you can do a lot of pretty cool things. So there are a lot of opportunities there.
Josh, any thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to appreciate the comment you made, the BIFAD member, I'm sorry, I don't recall your name, but I do think there is more that practitioners, implementers can do, particularly NGOs, to help drive some of the demand for research. I think, unfortunately, there tends to be, there's a tendency that when we talk about resilience measurement, it sits within the M&E department, right? And that M&E department is funded by grants on projects. And so what you're measuring is sort of project-based, project-specific, and when that project comes to an end, you stop monitoring and evaluating it or measuring it. And I think that's been a failure on our part so far, but I think we're wising up to that, and I think there's more that we can do there to help drive that research agenda to improve the quality of our programs overall. But also, I think there's more that we can do to help bring in research partners more strategically on these things. And so I'm glad you brought it up, because I can take that home to Food for the Hungry and say, see, they think so too. So.
Well, if there aren't any other burning panelist comments, there is one, Nancy.
It's just an announcement. You'll probably be on a mailing list, because there will be a conference in the fall offered by a group of stakeholders on resilience measurement. So we'll be advertising that. It's in New Orleans, and Tulane is hosting it. It's after hurricane season.
Excellent. Well, we are almost exactly on time, so I think we deserve a round of applause for that.